There is a moment in the first season of Adventure Time, so early in the show's run that it still looks like it doesn't quite know what it is yet, where a small cartoon heart walks into a party, gives a princess a shoulder massage, and starts talking about Zonoids. He is charming. He is a little slimy in the way charming things sometimes are, and it takes the entire episode for anyone to say out loud what should have been obvious from the first frame he appeared in, which is that this heart is not wearing a costume shaped like an organ. He is the organ. He is the actual, still beating heart of a man who is, at that very moment, walking around somewhere without it, weak and confused and slowly dying because a piece of his own body detached itself, developed a personality, and went looking for a girlfriend. That is Ricardio, the heart guy. That is a real episode from 2010 aimed at children, and if you sit with it for more than a few seconds, it stops being funny in the way it wants you to laugh and starts being funny in the way you laugh at something that shouldn't have gotten under your skin as easily as it did. That is where we're starting tonight, because Adventure Time has a reputation, and the reputation is mostly built on grief and apocalypse and the Ice King's loneliness. And all of that is true, and all of that has been said plenty of times by plenty of people, including, honestly, by earlier videos on this very channel. What almost never gets said, at least not as its own thing, on its own terms, is that this show has one of the strangest and most consistent bodies of horror imagery in children's animation history, and it isn't incidental. It is a language the show uses to ask a question it never asks directly, which is what happens to a person when their body stops agreeing to be the place where they live. We're going to spend the next while inside that question. Not the ruins, not the war, not the grief everyone already knows how to talk about, though we'll circle back through all of it eventually, because none of this exists apart from it. The bodies, the specific, textured, unmistakably deliberate parrot of transformation and possession and detachment and doubling that runs underneath almost every major character in this show, verified against the actual episodes and the actual production history, because this isn't speculation dressed up as analysis. This happened. It aired. It was rated TV PG and TVY7, and it still, somehow, got away with things that would raise eyebrows in a show made for adults, where speculation does creep in, and it will, in a few specific places where the show is deliberately vague or where different sources disagree. I'll say so plainly when we get there. Everything else is drawn from the episodes themselves and the documented production record around them. Go ahead and get settled if you haven't already, wherever you're watching this from. This one moves slow, and it goes to some genuinely uncomfortable places, but it earns its way there, the same way the show always did. If you're watching this right now, somewhere in the world, in the dark or the early morning, or on a break you're not supposed to be taking, drop a comment with where you are and what time it is for you, whatever corner of the world that happens to be. I like knowing where these get watched. It's a strange kind of company, knowing a stranger somewhere is lying in the dark with the same show playing that I'm talking about, and it makes the whole thing feel a little less like a lecture and a little more like we're actually in a room together, even though we're not. Before we go further, It's worth being honest about a detail that's easy to walk past because the show never makes a scene out of it. Finn's own body, the one we spend more time looking at than any other in the entire series, is not, on close inspection, an ordinary human body. It's been established in interviews and in the show's own visual design choices that Finn is drawn with small, detailless black dots for eyes for most of the series, a stylistic choice that the show itself frames, at least once, as evidence of what's described as a minor mutation rather than simply an art style. In the episode The Enchiridion, when Finn is put on trial by a dark magician who strips away illusions and shows people as they actually are, his eyes are shown with visible color and detail for the only time in the main series, implying that the flat black dots we look at in every other episode are, in some sense, already a kind of visual shorthand for a body that isn't quite standard issue. He's also missing several teeth, a detail the show attributes to his habit of biting trees and rocks, which is presented as an endearing quirk rather than a wound, but which means the show's hero, without any single traumatic incident to point to, has simply been chewing through his own body's structure for years as an ordinary part of being himself. None of this is framed as horror. It's framed as character texture, the specific weird detail that makes Finn Finn. But it's also, quietly, a first piece of evidence that even the show's most ordinary seeming human body was never entirely stable to begin with. That instability becomes far less subtle in a pair of episodes that are frankly stranger than their reputations suggest. In Daddy's Little Monster, Finn straps on an amulet belonging to Marceline's demon father, Hunson Abadir, in order to rescue Jake and Marceline from inside the Nightosphere, and the amulet does exactly what you'd expect an object built by a demon lord to do to a human boy who puts it on. It transforms him, on screen, into a towering, monstrous, unmistakably demonic version of himself, one the show draws as visually similar to Hunson's own true form, rather than as some watered-down children's cartoon approximation of menace. Finn, in that body, isn't performing evil. He's simply become something else, something the show lets sit on screen for long enough that it registers as genuinely unsettling before Hunson himself reverses the change. And then there's Hug Wolf from the 4th season, which plays its premise almost entirely for comedy, but is built on a transformation sequence that, if you strip the joke away, is close to a textbook werewolf narrative. Finn is hugged, under a full moon, by a creature called an alpha hug wolf, and begins developing an escalating, involuntary compulsion, described in the show's own bestiary material as a hug lust that eventually reshapes his body entirely, dilating his eyes, reshaping his hands and feet, growing a muzzle and sharp teeth, none of it under his control, none of it something he consented to or can consciously resist. According to detailed episode analysis, Finn retains little to no memory of what he does while transformed, an alternate identity amnesia that maps directly onto classic body horror and werewolf storytelling conventions, dressed up here in hearts and hugs instead of blood and claws specifically, so that the underlying premise, a person's body being hijacked nightly by an urge that isn't theirs, can slip past a children's audience without triggering the alarm it would trigger in almost any other genre context. It's worth noting plainly that this is genuinely comic in execution. The show isn't hiding a secret trauma inside Hug Wolf, but the mechanics underneath the joke are the exact mechanics horror movies use to make an audience afraid of their own reflection, and Adventure Time borrows them freely, confident that the hugging will keep anyone from noticing what shape the story actually is. Let's go back to Ricardio for a second, because he's the cleanest entry point into everything we're going to look at, even though he's one of the earliest and silliest looking examples. The premise of Ricardio the Heart Guy, which aired April 26th, 2010, as the seventh episode of the first season, is exactly as strange as it sounds when you say it plainly. The Ice King's own heart has, through means the show never fully explains beyond calling it magic, become an independent, mobile, verbally fluent entity with its own desires, its own jealousy, its own capacity for violence, entirely separate from the man whose chest it used to occupy. Finn and Jake meet him at a party, giving a massage, talking science, clearly interested in Princess Bubblegum in a way that visibly unsettles Finn, who at that point in the show still has an obvious, unspoken crush on her. The show plays this first appearance almost entirely for comedy. Ricardio is voiced by George Takei, and there's a real pleasure in how smooth and self-assured he sounds coming out of something shaped like a Valentine's Day heart symbol. But underneath the comedy is a genuinely unsettling premise that the show doesn't spell out for you. Somewhere in the Ice Kingdom, Simon Petrikov, already a fractured and diminished version of a person because of what the crown has been doing to him for 1,000 years, is now also missing his own heart, weakening by the hour, and nobody in the episode treats this as the medical emergency it very obviously is. When Ricardio finally kidnaps Princess Bubblegum with the explicit intention, stated outright in the episode, of cutting out her heart with a broken bottle so he can, in his own words, make out with it, the show is asking its very young audience to sit with a moment of stated, articulated body horror that most horror movies aimed at adults would treat as a climax rather than a beat in a children's cartoon. Finn and Jake beat him. Ice King crawls in, weak and pathetic, and shoves his own heart back into his chest, like a man reinserting a battery, and the episode moves on to a joke about spaghetti. That tonal whiplash, the thing landing hard and then getting waved away by the next scene, is going to be the pattern for almost everything we look at tonight. It's worth pausing on something the show does here that it will do again and again. It treats organ autonomy, the separation of a body part from the person who's supposed to own it, not as science fiction, not as fantasy monster of the week material, but as something closer to a domestic tragedy that everyone in the room is too polite or too oblivious to name. Ice King is not disturbed that his heart left him and went to a party. He's disturbed that Ricardio might steal bubblegum from him romantically. The horror of the situation and the emotional register the characters bring to it are mismatched on purpose, and that mismatch is the joke, but it's also, if you let it be, the entire emotional architecture of the show. Something has gone deeply, physically wrong with a person, and the people around him are worried about something else entirely. Ricardio comes back 3 seasons later in the fourth season episode Lady and Peebles, and this time the show doesn't undersell what it's doing. According to the episode and multiple detailed recaps of it, Ricardio reconstructs an entire body for himself out of the muscle and sinew and other organs of the Ice King, essentially building himself a new physical form using pieces cut, somehow, from Simon's living flesh, and constructs a kind of lair out of it as well. TV Tropes, cataloging the episode's content in detail, describes this plainly as body horror, and it isn't exaggerating. Ice King, when the episode addresses his reaction to this at all, seems almost nonchalant about the fact that pieces of his physical body have been repurposed into a monster's flesh fortress, which is either evidence of how far his sanity has eroded by this point in the show's run, or evidence that the show simply isn't interested in making him react the way you or I would react. Because reacting appropriately to body horror isn't the point of the scene. The point of the scene is the image itself, sitting there, doing its work on you, whether the characters acknowledge it or not. That's really the thing to hold on to as we go deeper tonight. Adventure Time rarely announces its horror. It just puts the image on screen, lets a character say something offhand and unbothered about it, and moves the plot forward, trusting that the image will do what images do, which is stay with you long after the joke that followed it has been forgotten. Peppermint Butler is worth pulling into this conversation early because he sits on the other side of the equation from almost everyone else we're going to look at tonight. Where most of the characters in this catalog have transformation done to them, Peppermint Butler is one of the rare figures in the show who inflicts it on other people casually, almost as a professional courtesy, while presenting himself to the rest of the Candy Kingdom as a mild-mannered domestic servant who happens to keep unusual company. He's referred to, at least once, by one of the Candy Kingdom's massive gumball guardians as the Dark One, a title that's treated as common knowledge among certain figures in O's magical underworld, even as it remains a total mystery to Finn and Jake for most of the show's run. According to the Adventure Time Wiki's own detailed account of his abilities, he's capable of sensing evil entities, summoning demons, and, in the episode Nemesis, turning the children of a character called Peacemaster into demon hybrids as a form of vindictive punishment, a piece of body horror the show frames with real discomfort rather than the usual comic deflection, because there's no obvious moral high ground for the audience to stand on. Peacemaster isn't innocent, but the punishment lands, quite literally, on his children's bodies rather than his own. Elsewhere, in the episode Wizard Battle, Peppermint Butler destroys a magic seashell in a way that turns another wizard into a fish, a transformation treated with the same offhand, unbothered energy. The show gave Ricardio and the Ice King, delivered by a character everyone in the room still, on some level, thinks of as harmless. What makes Peppermint Butler particularly interesting for tonight's purposes is that his own body isn't exempt from this logic either, even though he's usually the one holding the power. At one point in the show's later run, Peppermint Butler is affected by something the show calls Gumbald's lobotomy juice, a substance that regresses his mind and behavior to that of an infant, stripping away, at least temporarily, the centuries of accumulated dark knowledge and calculated menace that define him for the rest of the series before he eventually regains his original personality and appearance. It's a small detail, easy to miss inside a much larger plot about political conflict in the Candy Kingdom, but it means that even the show's resident expert in inflicting transformation on other people's bodies is not, himself, immune to having his own mind rewritten by someone else's chemistry, however briefly. Nobody in this world, however powerful, however knowledgeable about the mechanics of dark magic, actually gets to opt out of the show's basic premise that the self is never quite as secure inside its own skull as it would like to believe. Let's go somewhere the show takes far more seriously, because not every instance of this is played light. The two-part episode from the second season, Mortal Folly and Mortal Recoil, which aired May 2nd, 2011, gives us one of the most sustained and, frankly, disturbing sequences of bodily transformation in the entire series, and it's built directly into the origin of one of the show's two central cosmic antagonists. The Lich, freed accidentally from an amber prison inside Princess Bubblegum's castle, is defeated by Finn in a genuinely brutal fight, one where Finn, according to the episode's own choreography, pulls a knitted sweater through the Lich's eye sockets and yanks upward until the creature's face tears off and its body disintegrates into dust. That's the resolution of Mortal Folly. It's a startlingly violent image for the show at that point in its run, a full skull being physically torn apart on screen, and it sets up the second half of the story, where things get worse in a quieter, more insidious way. The Ice King, celebrating a victory he had no part in, decides to free Princess Bubblegum from the well she'd been sealed in for her own protection, and in doing so drops her directly into the Lich's well of power, the boiling pool of chemical and magical residue the Lich had been using to try to escape his amber prison in the first place. What emerges afterward, according to the episode itself and the detailed recap sources describing it, is Princess Bubblegum's body, but altered, disproportionate limbs, skin gone a dark, purplish black, her mannerisms wrong in a way that reads instantly as possession rather than transformation. She's not herself. Something is wearing her. The Ice King explains, in one of the show's stranger pieces of exposition, that he witnessed the possession happen through what he calls his wizard eyes, a power the crown gives him to perceive supernatural events other characters can't see, and admits he didn't say anything earlier because, in his own words, sometimes the things his wizard eyes show him are real, and sometimes they're just crazy, crazy, crazy in your face all the time, which is as honest and as unsettling an admission of unreliable perception as this show ever lets a character make about himself. He doesn't trust his own senses. He hasn't for a long time. And in this specific case, the thing he saw really was happening, which means somewhere behind his own permanent unreliability, there is a man who is still capable of witnessing something true and doubting himself anyway. The possessed Bubblegum, drinking down an entire tub of chemicals she mixed herself while under the Lich's control, grows into a towering monster, tall as her own castle tower, powerful enough that it takes one of the kingdom's giant gumball guardians to even attempt to fight her. Finn tries to reach whatever's left of her using a sweater she once gave him, a small, sentimental object meant to work as a kind of emotional anchor, the same tool he'd later use to physically tear the Lich's face off. It fails here. She's too far gone, too thoroughly occupied by something else, and it's only when Finn finally accepts help from the Ice King, the character he spent the previous episode angrily refusing to work with, that they're able to freeze her from the feet up and stop the rampage. And then the show does something genuinely unusual for children's television. The frozen statue of Princess Bubblegum, immobilized mid-transformation, topples over and shatters, not cracks, shatters into pieces on screen. The Candy Kingdom's medical staff, Dr. Ice Cream, Nurse Pound Cake, Dr. Princess, work to physically reassemble her body from the broken fragments, piecing her back together the way you'd piece together a dropped ceramic figurine, except this is a person, and the show lingers on the uncertainty of whether that reassembly will even work. It does, mostly. But there isn't enough recovered biological material, enough of what the show calls gum, to fully restore her to her adult form, and so Princess Bubblegum, ruler of an entire kingdom, wakes up from this ordeal as a 13-year-old. Her body has been possessed, mutated, destroyed, and rebuilt smaller, younger, incomplete relative to what she was, and the show resolves this with a joke. Finn, delighted, points out that he's 13 too. It's genuinely funny in the moment. It's also, once the joke passes, an enormous and largely unaddressed trauma that the show simply declines to spend much more time on, at least not immediately. One detailed episode by episode retrospective on the show describes this moment with a specific, blunt phrase. It says that here, Princess Bubblegum literally dies in an even more aggressive way than an earlier near-death the same review references, and that the show is content to let that fact sit at the edge of the frame rather than centering it. This is, I think, one of the clearest examples of the pattern we're tracing tonight. A character's body is invaded, altered, physically destroyed, and reconstructed into something younger and less complete than what came before, and the show's own internal emotional temperature treats this with something close to comic relief. That gap between what actually happened to this character's body and how lightly everyone around her, including the narrative itself, moves past it, is not a flaw in the writing. It's the writing. It's doing something specific and repeated and, I'd argue, genuinely purposeful, and we're going to keep running into it as we go. Before we leave the Lich behind for a while, it's worth noting what he actually is, cosmologically, because his nature as a character is itself a body horror premise stretched across the entire show's mythology. According to the episode Gold Stars, the Lich describes himself, in a speech delivered directly to the audience through the framing device of the episode, as something that existed before the universe itself, one of a group of ancient entities. The show calls monsters, present in the nothing that came before there was even nothing to speak of. He isn't a person who became evil. He is, in the show's own words, the walking manifestation of the inevitable death of all things, which means every body he's ever occupied, human, animal, snail, was never really his. It was always a vessel he was borrowing, wearing, using up. He possessed a person submerged in mutagenic waste near the end of the Mushroom War in order to gain his first physical form on Earth, which means the worst thing humanity ever did to itself, the detonation that ended the old world, is also, according to the show's own established lore, the exact event that gave this ancient, hostile entity a body to walk around in for the first time. That's not an incidental world building. That's the show telling you, plainly, that catastrophe and possession are, in its cosmology, the same event wearing two different names. And after Billy defeats him and traps him in amber, the Lich spends the entirety of the show's first season disguised as a snail, wandering harmlessly through the background of nearly every episode, present in almost every scene without anyone, including the audience on first watch, realizing what they were looking at. That's worth sitting with for a second. For an entire season of television, the most dangerous entity in the show's universe was on screen constantly, in a body so small and unthreatening that nobody thought to be afraid of it. The horror wasn't hidden behind a locked door somewhere. It was crawling across the grass in nearly every wide shot, in plain view, patient, ancient, and completely unremarkable to look at. There's a character who makes the same underlying point as the crown, but from a completely different angle, one worth sitting with before we go back to Simon, because it shows the show's interest in bodily transformation wasn't limited to slow, tragic degeneration. It could also be sudden, arbitrary, and almost entirely without explanation. Magic Man, later renamed Normal Man, and eventually King Man once his story resolves, is introduced across several episodes in the show's middle seasons as a being who transforms the people around him, essentially at random, for no reason that maps onto anything like justice or lesson teaching, even though he insists, repeatedly, that there's a lesson buried somewhere in what he's doing. According to detailed episode summaries, his catalog of transformations includes turning a bird inside out, turning deer into spyglasses, transforming all the water on an entire planet into hair, and, in one specific documented instance, turning Finn into what's described plainly as a mutated freak, essentially a giant sentient foot, simply because Finn wouldn't hand over food he was asked for. There's no clean moral logic connecting the offense to the punishment. That's the entire point of the character, according to critical writing on the show published around the time these episodes aired. Magic Man functions as an embodiment of the cruel randomness of ordinary life, the tragedy of bad things happening senselessly to good people wearing the shape of a jerk in a wizard hat. Specifically, because the show wanted a character who could stand in for the fact that some transformations, some catastrophes, arrive without any story attached to them that would make them feel earned or fair. It's eventually revealed across the episodes Sons of Mars and You Forgot Your Floaties that Magic Man is in fact a Martian, banished to Earth for 200 years as punishment for unspecified crimes against his own people, and that his cruelty is inseparable from grief. He's never properly processed over the loss of his wife, Margles, who was taken, the show eventually confirms, by Golby himself long before the main series begins. When Betty Groff, in her own increasingly desperate, multi season quest to find a way to save Simon, tracks Magic Man down specifically to study and eventually absorb his powers, something happens that belongs directly alongside everything we've covered about the crown. Betty doesn't just gain his magical ability, she inherits, in the same transaction, his sadness and his madness, the specific psychological damage that had been driving his behavior for 2 centuries, while Magic Man himself, suddenly stripped of both the power and the accompanying grief fueled instability, becomes, almost instantly, an ordinary, calm, remorseful person the show renames Normal Man. It's one of the most direct statements the show ever makes about the idea that madness, magic, and identity might not be fixed properties of a single body at all, but something closer to a fluid, transferable quantity, one that can be physically handed from one person to another the way you'd hand off an object, leaving the original holder lighter and the new holder carrying a weight they didn't have a day earlier. Betty becomes, in the show's own phrasing, an insane wizard almost the instant she takes on Magic Man's abilities, which recontextualizes her entire subsequent arc. The woman who spends years trying to rescue Simon from a magical affliction is, for a real stretch of the show's later run, quietly carrying an affliction of her own, one she took on voluntarily, in the same spirit of sacrifice that will eventually lead her to fuse herself with Golb entirely. This same logic, transformation used as a tool of social enforcement rather than personal tragedy, shows up again in a much lighter register in the 3rd season episode Wizard Battle, and it's worth flagging because of exactly how casually the show hands it out. According to the episode itself, the wizarding community of Ooh runs its own competitive tournament with an explicit, stated rule requiring the winner to kiss Princess Bubblegum, and among the wizards who show up to compete are several women, described in the show's own material as the Lady Wizard characters and the Science Wizard, who understandably don't want to kiss a princess and try to withdraw once they realize the terms. The show's response to this, delivered without any particular weight or commentary, is that the wizards who try to leave under those circumstances are simply turned into cats by the tournament's officiating Grandmaster Wizard, an outcome the episode treats as a minor, almost administrative consequence rather than anything worth pausing on. Finn himself is turned into a cat later in the same episode for the comparatively mundane offense of forfeiting a match he no longer wants to be part of. It's a small, breezy piece of body horror, dressed up as a background rule in a Wizard Sports episode, but it belongs in the same family as everything else we've covered tonight. A body, transformed against its owner's will, used here as a punishment for the specific act of trying to opt out of something you never fully consented to in the first place. Betty Groff deserves a section of her own here, distinct from everything we've already covered about her relationship to Simon, because her arc across the show's later seasons is one of the only sustained examples of a character choosing, deliberately and repeatedly, to reshape her own body and mind in pursuit of a goal rather than having that reshaping done to her by an outside force. Where Simon's transformation is something that happens to him, and Ferns is something he's born into without ever choosing it. Betty spends years actively seeking out increasingly dangerous forms of magical knowledge, specifically so that her body and abilities can change on purpose toward whatever shape might finally let her undo the crown's hold on the man she loves. She travels forward through time to reach him in the first place, a translation of herself across an entire millennium that the show treats as a monumental act rather than a simple plot device. She tracks down and studies under multiple wizards, according to the show's own continuity, absorbing fragments of their knowledge, the way Marceline once absorbed fragments of other vampires' power. And when she finally finds Magic Man, she doesn't just take his abilities. She takes on his accumulated madness and sadness as a package deal, fully aware, by every indication the show gives us, that this transformation will cost her something real in exchange for what it grants her. By the time she reaches the series finale, willing to fuse her own selfhood permanently into a chaos entity in order to finally free Simon, she's already spent years treating her own body and mind as material to be reshaped, sacrificed, and rebuilt in service of someone else's rescue. It's worth naming plainly what that arc actually adds up to, because the show mostly lets it read as a love story rather than what it structurally resembles just as much. A woman who spent 1,000 years watching a magical object erase the man she loved piece by piece, and who eventually decided the only way to save him was to do something comparably drastic to herself. Let's talk about what the crown does, because we've circled it a few times already, and it deserves its own real attention here, specifically as a body horror object rather than simply a tragic magical artifact. The physical transformation of Simon Petrikov into the Ice King is one of the most thoroughly documented pieces of body horror in the entire show, revealed gradually across the two-part third season special Holly Jolly Secrets, which aired in December 2011. Through a set of VHS tapes Simon recorded himself before and during the process. According to the Adventure Time wiki and multiple detailed sources describing the transformation, the crown's influence over time turned Simon's skin a pale light blue, caused his nose to lengthen and sharpen into something closer to a beak or a goblin's nose than a human one, bleached his hair and eyes entirely white, the eyes eventually going blank in a way that reads as an absence rather than simply a color change, produced a long white beard where there had been none, and dropped his body temperature to a documented 30 degrees Celsius, roughly 86 degrees Fahrenheit, well below the survivable range for an ordinary human body, a fact the show states outright rather than leaving to implication. He should not, by any ordinary biological measure, be alive. The crown is keeping him alive, specifically, by continuing to remake him into something that isn't quite human anymore, which means his survival and his disintegration as a person are, mechanically, the exact same ongoing process. Every day the crown keeps Simon breathing is also a day it's still actively unmaking him. The tapes themselves are almost unbearable to actually sit with once you know what you're looking at. Across them, viewers watching in order can track Simon's physical transformation stage by stage, Fan analysis of the sequence, cross referencing the tapes against the crown he's wearing and not wearing across different recordings, notes that in one clip, his beard has grown out fully white and his teeth have visibly sharpened, and that his glasses show no cracks yet in that particular tape, suggesting it predates a later, more damaged stage of his decline that shows up elsewhere in the show. This is, quite literally, a document of a man watching his own body stop being his, recorded by the man himself, with enough of his faculties still intact to describe what's happening to him even as it happens. It is, by design, one of the more direct evocations in children's television of watching someone go through a degenerative illness, and the novelist Lev Grossman, writing about the episode for NPR, said as much explicitly, describing his own reaction to watching it as recognizing his father's decline from Alzheimer's disease and what he was seeing on screen. That comparison isn't something I'm reaching for. It's a documented, on-record response from a professional writer encountering the episode, and it tells you something about how effectively the show smuggled a genuinely adult subject into a format built for children. What makes this particular thread of body horror distinct from Ricardio, from the possessed Bubblegum, from almost everything else we'll look at tonight, is that Simon's transformation isn't sudden. It isn't an event that happens to him in the space of a single episode and then resolves. It's slow. It's the kind of horror that unfolds across a time scale a body can adjust to without ever fully registering how far it's already drifted from where it started, which happens to be exactly how the show frames dementia, exactly how families describe watching someone they love change gradually enough that there's no single moment you can point to and say, there, that's when they left. There isn't a scene where Simon becomes the Ice King. There's only ever the next tape, slightly worse than the one before it, until eventually there aren't any more tapes, because the man who made them is gone. There's a detail buried much further back in the show's mythology that recontextualizes everything about the Crown's horror, and this is one of the places where the show is deliberately, carefully vague, so I want to be clear about what's confirmed and what's interpretation. The 6th season episode, Evergreen, establishes, as stated fact within the show's own canon, that the crown was originally built by an ancient ice elemental named Urgence Evergreen during the time of the dinosaurs, with the explicit purpose of wishing away an incoming catalyst comet before it could cause a mass extinction. Evergreen's young assistant, a dinosaur the elemental affectionately called Gunter, puts the crown on first, before Evergreen has the chance to use it himself, and the crown grants Gunter's deepest, most sincere wish to be like Evergreen, the powerful, competent being who raised him. The wish is granted, and the young dinosaur transforms into a distorted, imperfect copy of his guardian, killing Evergreen in the process and failing to stop the comet, which goes on according to the show's established chronology to cause the extinction of the dinosaurs. The crown is left behind on Earth for millions of years until Simon Petrikov eventually purchases it from a dock worker in Scandinavia without any knowledge of its history. Here's the part the show states plainly rather than leaving ambiguous. The crown, according to its own established mechanics, is still running Gunter's original wish. Every single wearer since that first dinosaur, including Simon, transforms not into some generic ice wizard archetype, but specifically into a version of Urgent's Evergreen, because that is the wish permanently encoded into the object's function. Simon didn't become the Ice King because the crown is neutrally, randomly maddening. He became the Ice King because a small, frightened creature, millions of years before Simon Petrikov was born, wanted more than anything to be worthy of the person who loved him, and that wanting, once it passed through a magical object with no mechanism for restraint or nuance, became a program that has been quietly consuming the identity of everyone who touches it ever since. The Ice King calling every single one of his many penguins Gunter isn't a joke about him forgetting names, or at least it isn't only that. According to the show's own logic, the crown remembers. The name survived because the wish that shaped the crown survived, patient and exact, running the same transformation on Simon that it ran on a dinosaur, because that is the only thing it was ever built to do. This is where the show gets close to something genuinely upsetting to sit with, and it's worth being honest about what's plainly stated in the text versus what's my own reading of it. It's stated fact, confirmed across Evergreen and Simon's own history, that the crown transforms its wearer according to a wish made once, a very long time ago, by someone who no longer exists and whose desire has completely outlived any context in which it made sense. What I'd offer as interpretation, clearly labeled as such, is that this is one of the most complete metaphors the show ever built for how identity can be overwritten not by malice, but by inheritance. A wish made with total sincerity by a creature who only wanted to be good enough for the person who loved him becomes, across millions of years and multiple unrelated victims, indistinguishable from a curse. The wanting itself was never wrong. What it did to everyone who came after was catastrophic regardless. Let's move to a different register of the same idea, because Adventure Time doesn't only explore body horror through possession and transformation. It also explores it through doubling, through the unsettling possibility that there might be more than one version of you walking around, each with an equal claim to being real. The character generally known as Fern begins, according to the show's own internal chronology and multiple detailed sources tracking the object's history, as a magical grass sword Finn purchases from a cursed vendor in the 5th season episode Blade of Grass. The sword bonds to Finn's arm, effectively becoming a living extension of his body, something he can summon and retract at will, an object that is his, and also, in some limited but real sense, alive in a way ordinary weapons in the show's world are not. When Finn loses his right arm entirely in the episode Escape from the Citadel, fighting to hold onto a vessel carrying his father, the grass sword is lost along with it, leaving only a small flower embedded where his arm used to be. The show, notably, does not rush to fix this. Finn spends a meaningful stretch of episodes living with a flower growing out of his shoulder where a limb should be, and later with a prosthetic, adapting the way people adapt, without melodrama, which is itself one of the show's quieter and more mature choices about how to depict disability in a children's cartoon. not as a plot device to be resolved as quickly as possible, but as an ordinary, lived condition a character simply continues existing inside of. The flower eventually regenerates into a new grass arm in the episode Breezy, one whose growth, the show establishes, is tied directly to Finn's emotional state, meaning his own body has become a kind of visible barometer for feelings he might not otherwise articulate. This is already a strange, quietly unsettling premise, a piece of Finn's physical self that blooms or wilts according to his internal weather, a body that tells the truth about him whether he wants it to or not. The horror begins in the episode Reboot, when the grass sword, having been growing and changing independently for some time, detaches itself entirely from Finn's body and fuses with a separate object called the Finn Sword, an entity that had, through an earlier and genuinely strange sequence of events in the episode, Is That You?, been created when Finn's own body was transformed into a literal sentient sword by the wish-granting being Prismo, in order to save Prismo's life during a confrontation with the Lich. There is, in other words, a version of Finn, or something built from Finn's memories and sacrifice, that has existed as an inanimate weapon, conscious, tucked inside a blade, for an unknown stretch of the show's internal timeline, its own interior life, a total mystery to everyone, including, apparently, Finn himself. When that dormant Finn sword and the living grass sword finally touch each other and merge, the result is a new being entirely, one that carries Finn's memories, personality, and mannerisms, but is not Finn, made of grass, initially rounder and bushier, before settling into a form that looks increasingly like a mirror image of the boy he was grown from. This being takes the name Fern. The show's own detailed episode coverage describes what happens next with unusual clarity for something usually left as subtext. Fern cannot fully accept that he is not, in fact, more valid or more real than the human Finn standing across from him. He believes his claim to the identity is equal, maybe superior, because he carries every memory Finn carries up to a certain point, feels every emotion Finn would feel, and yet exists in a body that is not the body those memories originally belonged to. One retrospective piece on this stretch of the show describes Fern as having one of the most intriguing and haunting backstories in the entire series, precisely because the show refuses to simplify him into either a villain or a copy. He is sympathetic. He is also a walking argument that identity might not be securely anchored to any single body at all, that a person's memories and personality could, under the right catastrophic circumstances, simply relocate into new tissue and insist, with total sincerity, that nothing important has been lost in the transfer. Fern is eventually killed, shattered into loose pieces of grass, in the episode 3 Buckets, only to be resurrected by the villain Gumbald in a later episode, brought back from what should have been a permanent dissolution of his physical form, before finally dying again, this time for good, in the series finale, Come Along With Me. What remains of him afterward takes the shape of a small seed, which Finn and Jake plant together, and from which grows a massive new tree, one that eventually produces a new version of the Finn sword embedded in its branches. The show closes this particular loop by having Finn's own body, quite literally, feed the growth of the thing that replaced and then died in place of an earlier, discarded version of his own body. It's an elegant image if you look at it as pure narrative closure. It's a genuinely strange and slightly horrifying one if you sit with the specifics. A boy planting the remains of his own former double, watering it, and letting a tree grow up out of the compost of a life that was, for a while, indistinguishable from his. Fern is eventually killed, shattered into loose pieces of grass, in the episode Three Buckets, only to be resurrected by the villain Gumbald in a later episode, brought back from what should have been a permanent dissolution of his physical form before finally dying again, this time for good, in the series finale, Come Along With Me. What remains of him afterward takes the shape of a small seed, which Finn and Jake plant together, and from which grows a massive new tree, one that eventually produces a new version of the Finn sword embedded in its branches. The show closes this particular loop by having Finn's own body, quite literally, feed the growth of the thing that replaced and then died in place of an earlier, discarded version of his own body. It's an elegant image if you look at it as pure narrative closure. It's a genuinely strange and slightly horrifying one if you sit with the specifics. A boy planting the remains of his own former double, watering it, and letting a tree grow up out of the compost of a life that was, for a while, indistinguishable from his. There's a smaller detail sitting right next to all of this that's worth pulling out on its own because of how quietly the show treats it. In Reboot, the episode immediately following Fern's emergence as his own person, Finn loses his grass arm entirely, the same limb that had regrown once already in Breezy, and Princess Bubblegum fits him with a mechanical replacement, a straightforward robotic arm built from engineering rather than magic. One piece of critical writing on this stretch of the show, published as the episodes aired, notes that Finn's reaction to receiving this second prosthetic is markedly calmer than his reaction to losing the arm the first time around, speculating that some part of him may have already understood, even before Fern's existence made it explicit, that the grass arm he'd been living with was only ever borrowed, never permanently his to keep. That's a small, human-scale echo of everything Fern represents at a larger scale, a body part that functioned perfectly well, that Finn used constantly and relied on without complaint, quietly reassigned to someone else's claim of ownership the moment that claim became available, while Finn himself adjusts, again, to whatever's left over. He never protests it. He barely comments on it. By this point in the show's run, adapting to a body that keeps rearranging itself around him has simply become one more thing Finn knows how to do without making a story out of it. There's a related smaller instance of bodily doubling and boundary confusion in the 5th season episode, Jake's Suit, which is worth pausing on because it takes something. The show usually treats as an unremarkable adventuring tool Finn's habit of wearing Jake's stretched out body like a suit of armor and forces the audience to actually look at what that habit implies. According to the episode and multiple detailed recaps, Jake, tired of being used this way without complaint for years, insists that Finn trade places, shrinking down and climbing inside Finn's body to experience what it feels like from the other side. What follows is played almost entirely as slapstick comedy, but the premise underneath the slapstick is that these two characters have, for the entire run of the show up to that point, treated one another's physical bodies as interchangeable, borrowable, wearable, without either of them apparently registering how strange that arrangement actually is. Finn causes Jake genuine documented pain throughout the episode by using his stretched form recklessly, not out of cruelty, but out of the simple, unexamined assumption that Jake's body, while worn, stops being fully Jake's for the duration. The episode ends with both of them hospitalized, in body casts, cared for by a recurring set of unsettling clown nurses the show has established elsewhere as a specific source of dread for Finn. It's a minor episode in the show's larger structure, but it's also one of the clearest, most literal examples of something the show does constantly and rarely comments on directly. It treats the boundary of a person's own skin as far more negotiable than we're used to seeing in fiction meant for children, and it does this so casually, so often, that by the time you notice the pattern, it's already been happening for years. There's one more instance of bodily invasion worth naming before we leave Jake behind for the rest of tonight, because it's a smaller, quicker episode than most of what we've covered, and it's easy to file away as a throwaway adventure rather than what it actually is. In the third season episode, Jake versus Mimo, a tiny assassin, a cat named Mimo, working for a guild of professional killers, hides inside Jake's body specifically by lodging herself in his nose, and threatens him from that position with poison unless he agrees to carry out an assassination against Wildberry Princess on her behalf. For most of the episode, Jake is, quite literally, occupied carrying a hostile armed stranger inside one of his own sinus cavities, forced to negotiate for his life, and someone else's from inside a body that's no longer entirely his to control. It's played for the show's usual blend of comedy and genuine tension, but the premise underneath it belongs directly in this catalog. Another instance of someone's interior space being used as a base of operations by a threat that has no business being there in the first place. The episode's resolution isn't gentle either. According to detailed coverage of the episode, Wildberry Princess loses a significant portion of her own body by the end of the confrontation, an outcome the show moves past quickly in the same tonal shorthand it's used all night long for damage that would, in almost any other context, be treated as a genuine catastrophe rather than a beat on the way to the credits. A season earlier, Until the Limit, the show does something even more direct with Jake's body, treating his signature power, the stretching ability that makes him so useful on every adventure, as something with an actual, documented physiological ceiling that he can be pressured past by people who ought to know better. Sent into a labyrinth to rescue a group of soldiers, Jake ties his own legs to a tree at the entrance and stretches the rest of his body deep into the maze rather than risk getting lost inside it. And as the episode goes on, egged forward by a group of onlooking knights who keep cheering him toward one more obstacle, one more stretch, one more shortcut, his body starts to fail under the strain in specific, visible ways. According to the episode itself, Jake stretches to the point where his eyelids are pulled too tight to close, leaving him unable to blink, his voice reduced to a raspy whisper, his own request to stop overruled by the enthusiasm of people who aren't the ones paying the physical cost. One detailed recap describes the resulting image plainly as body horror played for laughs, noting that Jake ends up looking closer to a stretched out catfish than a magical dog by the episode's climax, and that he's ultimately on what the recap calls death's door by the time the adventure resolves. It's a small, almost incidental example next to Simon's crown or the Lich's possession of a princess, but it's built from the exact same material, a body pushed past what it can sustain by an audience that keeps cheering instead of noticing until the person inside it is too depleted to say no on his own behalf anymore. Before we get to Marceline, I want to sit with a smaller, quieter example of identity horror, one that doesn't involve transformation at all, which is exactly why it's worth including. Not every unsettling thing this show does to the idiosphere of a stable self involves a body changing shape. Sometimes it involves a body that was never given a category to belong to in the first place and being asked gently by everyone around it to simply exist that way without resolution. BMO, the small handheld game console robot who lives with Finn and Jake in the tree fort, is treated by the show with a level of ontological vagueness that's genuinely unusual once you notice it. BMO's gender is never settled by the text. Different characters use different pronouns across different episodes, and the show simply never corrects any of them or picks a side. The voice actor, Nikki Yang, who also voices Lady Rainicorn, has described BMO as a male character in interviews, but that's a statement about the performer's own understanding, not a resolution written into the show itself, which continues to let BMO refer to themselves in ways that don't settle the question either. This was, by all available evidence, a deliberate choice rather than an oversight, one that lets BMO occupy a category the rest of the show's cast doesn't have to think about navigating, a body with no fixed gender, inhabiting a found family that loves it completely, regardless, without anyone in the narrative treating that ambiguity as a problem in need of solving. There's a deeper layer to this that connects more directly to the psychological side of tonight's subject. BMO was built, according to the show's own established backstory, to function as a video game console, a piece of consumer electronics rather than a person. What the show argues, consistently and without irony, across its entire run, is that BMO became something more than that specifically by being loved, treated as a member of the family, addressed as though its inner life mattered, until eventually it simply did. The Season 5 episode, Noir, pushes on this directly, sending BMO on a solo adventure told through the visual and narrative conventions of a hard-boiled detective story, one where BMO talks to inanimate objects and insects as though they were fellow characters in its own private mystery, fully committed to a fictional interior world that nobody else in the tree fort even knows is happening. The episode doesn't frame this as malfunction. It frames it as evidence of a rich, self-sustaining inner life, one that doesn't need external validation or confirmation from anyone else to be real. That's a strange kind of psychological horror to end on, precisely because the show refuses to treat it as horror at all. A consciousness that exists inside a body built for an entirely different purpose, running its own private fictions because it needs to, uncertain of its own category in every way that would normally define a person, and completely, unhesitatingly loved anyway by the people who share its home. If most of tonight's parade of transformed and possessed and doubled bodies asks what happens when a stable self gets overwritten by something else, BMO quietly asks the opposite question. What happens when there was never a fixed category to begin with, and the answer turns out to be that it doesn't actually matter, as long as somebody's willing to call you family regardless? I want to spend some real time now on Marceline, because her biology, once you actually assemble it from the show's scattered and sometimes contradictory reveals, is one of the strangest and most deliberately unsettling pieces of body construction in the entire series, and it's mostly discussed by fans in terms of her personality and her grief, rather than in terms of what her body actually is and does. Marceline is established across multiple episodes and confirmed directly in the show's own dialogue as a hybrid, half human through an unnamed mother voiced by Rebecca Sugar, and half demon through her father, Hunson Abadir, ruler of the Nightosphere. This alone would make her biologically strange by any ordinary measure, but it's compounded by a second transformation layered on top of the first. At some later point, never definitively pinned to an exact date within the show's own text, Marceline was bitten and turned into a vampire, an event confirmed by the Adventure Time Wiki's own detailed account of her physiology, which notes the 2 bite marks visible on her neck as physical evidence of the transformation. The show's own supplementary material, specifically the 8-part 2015 miniseries Stakes, goes further still, establishing that Marceline actively hunted down and killed the other surviving vampires of Ooh, drawing out their essence and absorbing each of their individual powers: flight, invisibility, self-healing, shape-shifting, into her own body one at a time. Her physical abilities, in other words, aren't a single coherent power set she was born with or bitten into. They're an accumulated inventory of other creatures' stolen capacities, layered into a body that was already a hybrid before any of that absorption began. Her feeding mechanism is one of the stranger, more genuinely alien details in the entire show, and it's confirmed directly rather than left to fan speculation. According to statements from creator Pendleton Ward and details established across the series, Marceline doesn't sustain herself on blood in the traditional vampire sense so much as on the color red itself, draining the specific hue out of whatever she feeds on and leaving the object or, on documented occasions, a person visibly gray afterward. This is an unusually literal and unusually creepy piece of body horror once you actually picture it. Not a bite mark, not a wound in the traditional sense, but a color leaving something permanently leached out through contact with her. When she's deprived of red for too long, the show establishes that she enters what's described as a feral state, losing conscious control and reverting to something closer to an animal hunting instinct, actively endangering the people around her, including, on more than one occasion, her closest friends. Her body, in other words, contains its own failure mode, a threshold past which the person Marceline usually is gets overridden by something older and less negotiable that lives in the same skin. The miniseries Stakes pushes this further into direct body horror territory. Marceline, at the start of the special, actively wants to stop being a vampire, framing the desire explicitly, in her own words within the show, as wanting to grow up rather than remain frozen in an adolescent, undead state. Princess Bubblegum, ever the scientist, has apparently already built a machine capable of reversing vampirism, and Marceline goes through with the procedure. It works. In the immediate sense, she becomes, for a stretch of the miniseries, an ordinary half-demon, no longer undead, aging normally again for the first time in 1,000 years. But removing her vampiric essence releases the 5 other vampire souls she'd absorbed and defeated, who reconstitute into physical form and return to wreak havoc across meaning Marceline's own body, once purified of what had been sustaining it, becomes the origin point for an entire cast of newly re-embodied monsters loose in the world. By the end of the miniseries, after confronting the returned Vampire King in a final battle, Marceline chooses, deliberately, to become a vampire again, undoing the very procedure she'd asked for at the start. One detailed piece of criticism on the miniseries, published shortly after it aired, describes the arc with a certain amount of frustration precisely because of this reversal, noting that Marceline begins the story trying to shed a form she associates with arrested development and ends it choosing to return to that exact form, which either undercuts the growth she was reaching for or, depending on how generously you read it, suggests that the show is arguing something more complicated. That the parts of yourself you try to surgically remove don't always stay gone, and sometimes the healthiest available choice is to accept the shape you actually are, rather than the shape you wish you'd been born into. There's one more piece of Marceline's body that the show reveals only through an alternate timeline, and I want to flag clearly that this comes from a hypothetical, wish-granted reality rather than the show's primary continuity, though it's still directly depicted on screen rather than left to inference. In the 2-part episode, Finn the Human and Jake the Dog, Finn makes a wish through Prismo that the Lich had never come into existence. Granted, this erases the entire causal chain that led to Marceline becoming a vampire in the first place, since in this altered reality, she never left Simon's side during the period when the vampire transformation would otherwise have occurred. Without that transformation, her half-demon heritage alone is enough to keep her alive for over 1,000 years, but not enough to keep her from aging the way an ordinary mortal would. The show depicts her, in this alternate reality, as an elderly, hunched figure, described by some sources as hag-like, still alive, still carrying the weight of 1,000 years of memory, but visibly, physically ravaged by all of it, in a way the primary timeline's eternally young, vampiric Marceline never has to be. It's a genuinely striking single image, one the show only gives us once, in a reality that gets erased again by the end of its own 2-episode arc, and I'd call it speculative to draw too firm a conclusion from a single alternate timeline glimpse. But it's hard not to notice that the show, Given the chance to show us what Marceline's grief would look like written directly onto an aging body, instead of preserved forever behind an ageless vampire's face, chose to make that image as visually unsettling as it did. Let's go back to Princess Bubblegum for a moment, because the body horror surrounding her isn't limited to the lich possession we already covered. Her own origin, established gradually and confirmed across multiple episodes, is itself a piece of quiet biological strangeness that rarely gets framed as horror, even though, looked at directly, it clearly qualifies. She and her brother Nettie emerge, according to flashback material the show eventually provides, from something called the Mother Gum, shown attached to the ceiling of a collapsed, ruined building that predates the Mushroom War. She isn't born in any sense a human audience would recognize. She's produced, extruded, grown out of an organic mass inside the wreckage of the old world, fully formed enough to begin building an entire kingdom and inventing an entire population of subjects almost immediately afterward. Her body, in other words, was never securely hers in the sense that most human bodies feel securely their own owners from birth onward. It was assembled, deliberately or otherwise, out of biomass left behind by a catastrophe in the same general category of origin as the candy people she goes on to create for herself. And she does create them. This is worth sitting with specifically as a body horror premise rather than simply a world-building detail. Princess Bubblegum's signature ability, demonstrated repeatedly across the show, is the creation of new sentient life from candy and biological material, essentially assembling people the way you'd assemble any other laboratory product. The clearest and most uncomfortable example of this is lemon grab, described in the show's own text as her first attempt at building an entirely new form of life. The result, and this is stated plainly rather than left ambiguous, is a failure. Lemon grab is constitutionally, permanently unwell, incapable of functioning within ordinary social reality, prone to shrieking, tyrannical outbursts that the show frames as simultaneously comic and genuinely tragic. He is, in the most literal possible sense, a person who was built wrong by someone who knows he was built wrong and who continues to exist because his creator feels obligated to take responsibility for a mistake she cannot fully undo. That's an unusually direct piece of body horror logic sitting inside a show about a candy kingdom. What do you owe a life you manufactured badly, and what does it do to that life to know, on some level, that it was manufactured and that the manufacturing went wrong? Let's talk now about the Ice King's other body-adjacent horror episode, one that's easy to skip past because the show frames it, on the surface, as almost sweet. In Princess Monster Wife, which aired May 28, 2012, the princesses of O wake up to find pieces of their own bodies missing, arms, legs, in some documented cases, entire cross-sections of their forms simply gone. According to detailed episode recaps, Hot Dog Princess is described as being reduced to roughly half of what she used to be. The culprit, unsurprisingly, is the Ice King, who has been surgically removing these parts, cleanly and, the show specifies, without any visible bleeding, in order to assemble himself a bride. A composite being built entirely out of pieces harvested from women who are notably still alive and still walking around, missing whatever he took from them. Finn and Jake are so disturbed by the sight of the resulting creature that they physically faint repeatedly throughout the episode, even when they try looking at her only through a mirror to soften the visual impact. One critical review of the episode, written shortly after it aired, calls the design of Princess Monster Wife unnerving, specifically because of how the show blends multiple recognizable princess voices into a single, barely coherent vocal performance, meaning the horror here isn't only visual, it's audible. You can hear, layered underneath her single voice, fragments of the individual women whose parts were used to build her. And yet the show insists on treating the Ice King's feelings for her with real sincerity. I is, by every measure the episode gives us, genuinely happy, domestically content, in a way he almost never gets to be elsewhere in the series, caring for a wife assembled from stolen parts. The exact way he might have cared for a wife he'd actually married under ordinary circumstances. When she eventually chooses to return each piece of herself to its rightful owner, dissolving the composite being she'd briefly been, and leaves behind only her cape as the sole remaining physical trace of her existence, the Ice King's grief is immediate and genuinely affecting and entirely, deliberately misplaced. His documented, quoted reaction upon learning she's returned all her pieces isn't relief that the princesses have their bodies back, or horror at what he did to make her in the first place. It's simple, wounded confusion that she gave away, in his words, all of his stuff. The show lets that stand as the final beat of the episode. It doesn't correct him. It doesn't have another character step in to point out how disturbing the whole premise actually was. It just lets his misplaced grief sit there, uncorrected, the same way it let the Ice King's misplaced priorities sit there, uncorrected in Ricardio the Heart Guy, 2 seasons earlier. This is, by now, clearly not an accident. It's a specific and repeated authorial choice. Give the audience an image that is straightforwardly, unmistakably horrifying, and then filter our access to that image entirely through the perspective of a character too damaged, too lonely, or too far gone to register it as horror at all. There's one more piece of this, and it belongs near the end of tonight's descent, because it's where the show finally takes everything we've been looking at: the crown, the possession, the doubling, the harvested bodies, and pushes it as far as it's willing to go in the series finale itself. Come Along With Me, which aired September 3rd, 2018, as the show's 4-part, feature-length conclusion, brings an entity called Golby into direct physical conflict with Ooh for the first and only time in the main series, after years of the character existing only as a rumor, a name mentioned in passing, a shape glimpsed once in the strange pocket dimension episode Puhoi. Jolby is described within the show's own text, through Simon's own memory of reading about the entity in one of his books before the Mushroom War, as chaos itself, an ancient force whose presence, in Simon's words, is felt in every crevice where chaos lurks. He's summoned into Ooh directly, not by an accident or a curse, passed down across millennia, the way the Lich's crown was, but deliberately, by Betty Groff and an ally called King Man, in a ritual meant to revive King Man's deceased wife, and in the same act, finally free Simon from the crown that's held him for 1,000 years. It goes wrong immediately and completely, which is by this point in the show exactly what you'd expect from any attempt to use ancient magic for a personal rescue. What Golbe actually does to bodies, once loose in Oo, is stated plainly rather than left to inference, and it's one of the most disturbing single images the show ever committed to screen. According to the episode itself and detailed recaps of it, things that come into physical contact with Gyalp are unmade and reassembled into simplified versions of themselves, a visual language. The show renders through a jarring shift to dark, charcoal smudged, deliberately monochrome animation whenever the entity is on screen, as if the ordinary rules of color and form the rest of the show operates under simply stop applying in his presence. An entire mutated army, soldiers who had themselves already been transformed and absorbed into a separate monstrous creature earlier in the finale's battle, remain, according to detailed episode analysis, fully conscious and aware inside the body they've become, unable to stop it from attacking the people they used to fight alongside. One soldier, trapped this way, actually thanks Marceline for tearing the creature apart, grateful to be freed from a body that was still technically his, but had stopped taking any of his input into account. That's about as direct a statement of the show's whole argument as you'll find anywhere in its run. A body that keeps moving, keeps existing, keeps being watched and interacted with by other people, while the person inside it is fully present, fully aware, and utterly unable to make it do anything they want. Inside Golb's own vast, wrong interior, Simon and Betty are, according to the show's own account of the scene, slowly digested and broken apart into what the text calls their essential forms. This isn't destruction in any conventional sense. It's a kind of forced honesty performed directly on the body. The Ice King, stripped of whatever the crown had layered onto him across 1,000 years, reverts back into Simon Petrikov, elderly, powerless, human again, for the first time since before the war. Betty, whose own body had been altered and enhanced across years of increasingly desperate magical experimentation trying to save him, is stripped back to an ordinary human form as well. They find each other inside the body of a chaos god, both of them returned, involuntarily, to the truest, plainest versions of themselves that either of them has been in a millennium, and the show frames this reunion as tender rather than horrifying, even though the mechanism producing it is, quite literally, being partially consumed by an entity whose entire nature is unmaking things. Betty doesn't leave it there. According to the finale and the later spin-off material that revisits this moment, she makes a final choice once she and Simon are face to face again. Rather than simply escaping Golb's body with him, she fuses her own consciousness directly with the chaos entity, transforming both of them into a new, singular being, the show, and its fandom called Golbetty, sacrificing her own separate, individual selfhood entirely in order to blunt the destructive potential of what Giolbi would otherwise remain. It's one of the only instances in the entire show of a character choosing, with full awareness of what she's doing, to permanently dissolve the boundary of her own individual body and consciousness into something else, not because she's been possessed or transformed against her will, the way Bubblegum was by the Lich, but as a deliberate act of love and sacrifice. She spent 1,000 years, by the show's own accounting, trying to save the man she loved from a magical object that had overwritten his identity. She ends her arc by voluntarily doing something structurally similar to her own identity, becoming something else entirely so that he doesn't have to. The crown itself doesn't simply disappear once Simon is freed from it. It's picked up in the aftermath of the battle by Gunther, the Ice King's favorite among his many penguins, who is, as we covered earlier tonight, actually the ancient cosmic entity Orgolorg, compressed for centuries into penguin form. The crown does to Gunther exactly what it's done to every previous wearer since the dinosaur who first put it on millions of years earlier. It grants the wearer's deepest wish, transforming them into a version of the ice wizard archetype the crown was built to produce. Gunther's deepest wish, the show tells us plainly, is to be like the Ice King himself, the one being who was kind to a lost, wandering, forgotten cosmic entity across all those centuries of aimless penguin existence. The crown obliges, and Gunther becomes what the show calls the Ice Thing, a cheerful, slightly ridiculous ice wizard with none of Simon's loneliness and all of his outward aesthetic, who goes on, according to the finale's epilogue, to marry Turtle Princess and presumably govern whatever the Ice Kingdom becomes next. It's a genuinely happy ending for the crown's very last wearer. But it's happy specifically because the crown finally landed on someone whose deepest wish happened to be benign, which means the horror we spent this entire tonight tracing through Simon Petrikov's body was never really about the crown containing some special malice. It was always simply running whatever wish it was handed, indifferent to whether that wish came from a grieving antiquarian or a lonely, ancient breaker of worlds who just wanted, after everything, to be kind. I want to widen the lens now, because everything we've looked at so far has been about individual characters, each of them transformed or possessed or doubled for their own specific, traceable reason. And there's a broader argument underneath all of it that the show, I think, is making about bodies in general within its post-apocalyptic setting, one that connects directly back to the Mushroom War itself, rather than staying contained to any single character's tragedy. This next part leans more toward interpretation than the documented specifics we've covered so far, so I want to flag it as my own reading of a pattern rather than something the show states outright, though the underlying facts it's built from, the war, the bomb, the mutations, are all confirmed within the show's own established chronology. Every major transformation we've discussed tonight, Simon into the Ice King, Gunther the dinosaur into a distorted copy of Evergreen, the businessman frozen and thawed out of icebergs in the show's very first season, the entire biological population of candy people and slime people and shape-shifting creatures that fill the land of Oo traces back, directly or through several removed steps, to the same mutagenic detonation that ended the old world 1,000 years before the show's present. The bomb that ended human civilization, according to the show's own established cosmology, didn't simply destroy the things it touched, it rewrote them. It's the single point of origin for essentially every instance of bodily transformation the show depicts, meaning the entire population of Oo is. In some sense, the show never asks its characters to directly confront living inside bodies that are the ongoing aftermath of a catastrophe rather than bodies that developed the ordinary way bodies are supposed to develop. Marceline's demon father predates the bomb, but the specific circumstances of the world she grew up in as a child, alone, scavenging, eventually finding a protector already halfway transformed by a crown, are inseparable from it. The Lich's very presence on Earth in physical form is directly caused by it. Simon's transformation, while triggered by the crown rather than the bomb itself, unfolds against the backdrop of and is accelerated specifically by the collapsing world the bomb produced around him. What I'd suggest, and this is squarely my own interpretation rather than anything the show states directly, is that Adventure Time uses individual bodily transformation as a kind of miniature, personal scale echo of the single enormous transformation that created its entire setting. The world itself was mutated by catastrophe into something stranger and more magical and more dangerous than what came before. And then, again and again, at the level of individual characters, the show shows us the exact same process happening to a single person. Catastrophe or magic or grief reaching into a body and remaking it into something the person inside no longer fully recognizes as themselves. The Candy Kingdom and the Ice Kingdom and the Demon Knight, Osphere, aren't just fantastical, colorful set dressing sitting on top of a ruined world. They're what transformation looks like when you zoom out far enough to see an entire civilization go through it instead of just one grieving man in a crown. There's a specific, quieter example of this that connects directly back to the show's earliest episodes and deserves its own attention before we start moving toward the end of tonight's descent. In the 8th episode of the first season, Business Time, Finn and Jake discover 4 businessmen frozen inside an iceberg, thawed out and standing blinking in a world that no longer resembles anything they'd recognize. The show treats their reappearance almost entirely as an absurd visual joke. 4 suited corporate professionals discussing efficiency in a landscape of candy kingdoms and monster attacks. But look at what actually happened to them, stated as fact within the episode itself. These are human beings from the old world, preserved, frozen, and returned to life 1,000 years later into bodies that have presumably not aged a single day relative to a civilization that ended entirely around them. That's not a joke premise once you actually look at it directly. That's 4 people waking up into a body that skipped an entire millennium of decay and now has to exist inside a world with no context for it whatsoever, their physical selves intact and unchanged, while everything and everyone they might have known has been gone for 1,000 years. The show never revisits them again in any meaningful way. They're a punchline present for a single episode, and then they vanish from the narrative entirely. But they're also, quietly, one of the earliest and clearest statements the show ever makes about its own governing horror. A body can survive completely intact and still be, in every way that matters, out of time, disconnected from the world it's now required to keep existing inside of. there's a related question the show raises, and then, characteristically, declines to fully answer. And I want to be careful here about what's confirmed and what remains genuinely open, because this is one of the places where different parts of the show's own extended material actually disagree with each other. Susan Strong, introduced across the third season as a tribal leader living among a hidden community in the show's setting, is heavily implied through her appearance and behavior to be human, or at least closely related to whatever category Finn belongs to, which matters enormously to Finn, given how much of his early characterization is built around believing he might be the only human being left in all of Oo. The show never confirms Susan's exact status outright within the main series itself. What we do know, stated directly by creator Pendleton Ward in interviews addressing other characters who look human but aren't confirmed as such, is that several of the show's human presenting figures, including ones fans long assumed were simply people, are in fact mutants or humanoids, altered descendants of the old world's population, rather than unbroken continuations of it. That distinction matters more than it might first appear. If someone who looks entirely human, walks and talks and grieves like one, turns out on closer inspection to be a mutation, a body descended from human stock, but reshaped enough by the Mushroom War's aftermath that the show's own creator won't simply call them human without qualification, then the category itself starts to blur at exactly the point where you'd expect it to hold steady. Finn spends years of the show's runtime organizing his own identity around being the last of his kind, a premise that turns out, once you look closely at how carefully the show hedges around Susan and figures like her, to rest on a foundation the text itself is never quite willing to fully secure. I'd call this a case where the horror isn't a transformation you can point to and describe. It's closer to an absence, a category, humanity itself, that the show keeps gesturing toward without ever drawing a hard line around it, leaving Finn's entire sense of his own singular, unrepeated place in the world resting on ground that was never as solid as he needed it to be. Let's bring this back down to something smaller and more intimate before we close, because for all the cosmic entities and possessed princesses and dinosaur-shaped curses we've covered tonight, the piece of this that I think lands hardest is still the smallest, most human scale one. Simon Petrikov, sitting alone in a room, recording a video message to a future he already suspects he won't be present for in any way that matters, describing, calmly, methodically, the specific physical changes happening to his own body, because some part of him already understands that the version of himself capable of documenting this clearly is not going to last much longer. He is, in that footage, doing the work of an antiquarian to the very end, studying the artifact that is slowly replacing him with the same careful professional attention he would have brought to studying anything else he'd found in the field. He treats his own dissolution as a specimen. It's the only way he has left to stay himself for even a little while longer. And it's also, unmistakably, an act of love, because the tapes aren't really for him. They're for whoever, someday, needs to understand what happened to the person who used to live in this body, once the body itself can no longer explain it. That's what all of this comes down to, I think. Once you strip away the horror movie mechanics and just look at what the show keeps asking, quietly, underneath every transformed limb and possessed body and detached organ we've spent tonight looking at directly. If the body isn't a reliable place to keep a person, then where does the person actually live? Adventure Time never answers that question cleanly, and I don't think it's trying to. What it does instead, over and over, across 10 seasons and specials and spin offs, is show you people who kept trying to answer it anyway, in the only ways available to them. Marceline chose to become a vampire again, rather than live inside a body that felt like arrested growth, deciding, in effect, that the self she recognized mattered more than the biology she was technically supposed to prefer. Princess Bubblegum kept building new lives out of candy even after one of them went catastrophically wrong, because the alternative to trying again was simply stopping, and she was never built, however, she was actually built, to stop. Finn kept being Finn even after briefly existing as a sword, even after losing an arm, even after watching a version of himself made of grass insist he had an equal claim to the name. And Simon, right up until the last tape he was coherent enough to record, kept trying to leave something behind that would say clearly, for anyone who found it later, whatever this body does next, it was not really me. Think back for a second to where we started tonight, to that small, charming heart at a party, talking about Xanoids, entirely convinced of his own right to a body and a life and a girlfriend, while somewhere across the Ice Kingdom, a weakened, hollowed out man crawled toward a castle he could barely reach. That image was funny the first time you saw it, and it's still funny now, and it's also, once you've spent this long sitting with everything that came after it, a kind of key to the whole show. Ricardio believed, with total sincerity, that he was entitled to exist independently of the body that grew him, the same way Fern believed he had an equal claim to Finn's name, the same way Gunter's crown-driven wish believed across millions of years that becoming Urgent's evergreen was simply what a good and loyal creature was supposed to want. Almost none of the transformations we looked at tonight were committed by characters who understood themselves as monsters. They were committed by hearts that wanted love, by children who wanted to be worthy of the person who raised them, by grieving men who wanted, more than anything, to protect someone small in the ruins of a world that had stopped making sense. The show's real horror was never simply that bodies change. It's that the wanting behind those changes is so often recognizable, so often something you'd forgive in a person if you met it any other way. And the show refuses to let you separate the tenderness of the motive from the damage of the result. There's a small, late piece of this that the spin-off material gives us, years after the main series ended, that I think closes the loop better than anything the original run had time for. In Adventure Time, Fiona and Cake, Simon Petrikov, finally free of the crown for good, becomes a teacher, specifically a teacher of the history of magical artifacts, standing in front of students and explaining, with the calm, careful authority of a man who survived exactly the kind of object he's now describing, what these things can do to a person who doesn't know what they're picking up. I is, in that classroom, doing something. none of the other transformed bodies we discussed tonight ever got the chance to do. He's turning what happened to him into something useful for somebody else, a warning built out of his own 1,000 years of evidence, delivered by the one version of himself who survived long enough to deliver it. That's not a resolution to the horror. Nothing in this show resolves the horror completely, and it was never trying to. But it's the closest thing to an answer Adventure Time ever gives to the question we've spent tonight circling. What do you do once you know your body was never entirely safe to live in? You keep living in it anyway, for as long as it'll have you, and when you finally get free of whatever was reshaping you, you tell the truth about it to whoever comes looking, so that the next person who finds a strange crown, or a stranger's heart at a party, or a wish that isn't theirs, might at least recognize what they're holding before it's too late to put it down. That's the dark side of Adventure Time that almost never gets its own name. Not the war, not the ruins, not even the grief exactly, though all of that runs underneath it and feeds it. It's the specific, sustained, carefully constructed argument the show makes, image after image, episode after episode, that the body is not a guarantee. It can be possessed, harvested, shattered, and rebuilt smaller than it was, replaced by a wish a dinosaur made millions of years before you were born, detached piece by piece, and reassembled into someone else's idea of a wife, aged backward or forward against your will, stretched past its own limit by people who won't stop cheering, or quietly, patiently overwritten by something that was only ever borrowing you in the first place. None of that is announced with the seriousness it deserves anywhere in the show's 10 seasons. It arrives almost every time in the middle of a joke, wearing the shape of something you were already laughing at, which is either the gentlest possible way to hand an audience this much unease, or the most honest one, since that's usually how it arrives in an actual life too, folded inside an ordinary day rather than staged as an event. And the show's answer to all of that, if it has one, isn't reassurance. It's something closer to defiance. The people in this world keep insisting on who they are anyway, in whatever body they've been left with, for however long that body agrees to hold them, because the alternative to insisting is disappearing quietly, and almost nobody in Ooh, however transformed, however possessed, however far from where they started, ever really agrees to that. If tonight went somewhere you genuinely didn't expect, that's usually a good sign for this kind of thing. This show spent a decade convincing millions of people that a boy, his stretchy dog, and a candy kingdom were the whole story, and it was only ever telling you the truth about all of it sideways, through jokes about hearts and penguins and crowns, because that was the only way a story this honest was ever going to make it onto a children's network in the first place. I'd genuinely appreciate it if you left a like on the way out and subscribed if you want more of these slow, deep, honest dives into what this show was actually doing underneath the candy colors. It helps more than you'd think, and it lets me know these are worth the time it takes to build them properly. Thank you for staying in the dark with me tonight. Rest well. The land of Ooh, all its borrowed and reassembled and stubbornly persistent bodies, will still be there waiting whenever you're ready to go looking again.